Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 648, and today is August 1st, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We have a lot of important news to get to on today's show, but first, I need to spend some time talking about the show itself. Of course, the show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere that you could listen to audio podcast. And of course, you could follow me, find all the episodes of the show and all the work I do, news articles that I write. If I write it, it goes up on my Twitter account at @KyleAnzalone_. Now, also some other big news today. We're going to have a sponsor here at Conflicts of Interest for the next couple of months, and I'm very excited about this sponsor because it is the Expat Money Summit 2024, which is, of course, hosted by Mikhail Thorup, and I was recently on his show, the Expat Money Show, and honestly, one of the favorite interviews I have ever done. For people who talk foreign policy, I feel like it's sometimes a little bit rare that I get somebody who really has such a deep understanding and not only that, care about people throughout the world. And so I think it's really one of the best episodes that I have been, recorded on in some time. And I would recommend people check that out for that reason. But of course, somebody like that is going to host a fantastic summit. And so just a couple details here. It's taking place entirely online from October 7th to the 11th. Keynote speakers include Dr. Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Scott Horton, Tom Woods, Mark Favor, and Tom Logano. However, I will also be there on one of the panels along with Dave DeCamp, the news editor at antiwar.com. So to reserve your complimentary ticket, head on over to the expatmoneysummit.com. That's expatmoneysummit.com. And for those of you who do that, I do really appreciate it. Engaging with our sponsors does help out the show. So check it out. Again, I wouldn't recommend it if I didn't like it. I like Mikhail. I like all the guests that he has going to this thing. I think it's going to be an excellent event. And you don't have to travel for it. So it's not one of those things you got to spend hundreds of dollars on the flights and the hotels. Purely online event, and they're going to help you learn everything you need to know about crafting your perfect plan B, how to quickly acquire a second passport, diversify your finances offshore, invest in real estate, and get in-depth insights on geopolitics from world-renowned experts. So that is the new sponsor of the show. Again, it's the Expat Money Summit 2024, and you could get your tickets at expatmoneysummit.com. That's expatmoneysummit.com. All right, and with that, let's jump into the show today. We have a lot of really bad news to talk about. So this up first, Austin pledges the U.S. will defend Israel if it faces attack after latest escalations. So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said Wednesday that the U.S. would defend Israel if it faces attacks in response to the airstrike in Beirut that targeted Hezbollah commander and the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas's political bureau who was killed in Tehran. Israel has not formally taken credit for the killing of the Hamas leader, but Israeli intelligence have a long history of carrying out covert attacks inside Iran, including assassinations. Both Iran and Hamas have blamed Israel for the killing and vowing revenge. Iran is also saying that this could not have happened without the U.S.'s support, and so Washington is also taking the blame, at least from the Iranian side here. So the Iranian supreme leader said the following this bitter, tragic event which has taken place within the borders of the Islamic Republic, it is our duty to take revenge. The New York Times later reported that the Ayatollah issued an order for Iran to strike Israel directly in retaliation for the killing. The report, which cited 3 anonymous Iranian officials, said he gave the order at an emergency meeting of the Iran Supreme National Security Council on Wednesday morning. Austin, who is visiting the Philippines, was asked what assistance the U.S. would provide if a wider regional war broke out. We certainly will help defend Israel. You saw us do it in April. You can expect to see us do it again. Austin was referring to the U.S. and some of its allies intercepting Iranian missiles and drones that were fired at Israel in response to the April 1st Israeli bombing of an Iranian consulate building in Damascus, Syria. the consulate bombing, which killed a senior Iranian general, provoked the first ever Iranian attack on Israeli territory. U.S. officials claim they're working to ease tensions in the Middle East, but providing unconditional military to Israel and vowing to defend it from any consequences only emboldens the government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which appears determined to get the U.S. involved in a major war. If Iran and the other Shia militias in the region decide to coordinate an attack, it could involve targeting U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria, which are vulnerable to Iranian missiles. Rocket attacks on those bases restarted last week, and the U.S. bombed the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces on Tuesday. More on that later in the show. So, an unnamed Iranian official speaking with the Times said the coordinated strikes with Iran's allies was one option, although they didn't mention the possibility of attacks on U.S. bases. Another option would be a similar attack to what happened in April, which was a combined missile and drone attack that would be on military sites. So for a little bit more analysis on this, I want to go over my email that I'm sending out on the Libertarian Institute's daily debrief. And so if you aren't subscribed to that already, do that. That way you just get these emails every morning. This one will be out shortly after the show comes out. And so you'll be able to have it in your inbox if you head on over to the Libertarian Institute. While you're there, of course, make a donation because our fundraiser is still going on. But additionally, sign up for the newsletter because I've been writing these every morning. And this one is Netanyahu wants the U.S. to declare war on Iran. And so I, say Israel had assassinated these two Hezbollah figures and the Hamas figure, and this was going to lead basically to what Netanyahu wanted, which is a direct U.S. and Iranian war. So I write, with the assassination of two highly placed Iranian allies in the capitals of Iran and Lebanon, Netanyahu was attempting to provoke Iran. It may seem odd that the Israeli prime minister would attempt to get another country to attack Israel. After all, Tel Aviv relied on assistance from the Americans, Brits, and Jordanians to defeat a modest and highly telegraphed Iranian attack back in April. However, Netanyahu does not intend for Israel to do much of the fighting in this war. Rather, he understands to get the Americans to do the fighting and dying for Israel. Tehran will feel compelled to respond to the assassinations, especially Hayana, who was a political figure who was assassinated in Iran, and he was there to celebrate the inauguration of the new Iranian president. And so there was some pretty good analysis on this by Mohammed Sahimi at The Responsible Statecraft, and we're actually running this article today as a spotlight at antiwar.com. So if you head on over to the spotlight, the antiwar.com, that is the spotlight article. So Mohammed writes, in assassinating Hayana, Israel would have struck two targets, not one. The second was the new Iranian administration. On the day a reformist president was taking office, a foreign leader and an ally of Iran is assassinated, and as head of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, he must address the security crisis with international dimensions and implications. So, Mohammed is just really laying out how provocative it is for Iran. So the Iranian supreme leader has promised retaliation. Previously, Iran has carefully calibrated its responses to Washington and Tel Aviv to prevent escalations into a wider conflict. However, Sahimi argues that's going to be more difficult to manage this time. He writes, if Iran does nothing, it will be mocked throughout the region. Tehran's radicals will also relentlessly attack the president for supposedly being soft and a sellout, trying to cripple, if not topple, his administration and programs before they have even been started. He is already under attacks by extremists for seeking negotiations with the United States. If Iran does react strongly, it will add to the mountains of problems that it is facing. This is not what the president and his lieutenants had hoped for, but they may be forced to act, knowing that depending on how they respond, it may force the U.S. to get directly involved in defense of Israel, at a time when the president's administration was hoping to restart negotiations with Washington. Either way, Israel would be the temporary winner. So while it remains to be seen what the response is. Netanyahu is hoping for the Ayatollah to miscalculate and attack Israel in a way that draws the Americans into the fight. The simple solution to all this is to follow libertarian principles, which means telling Netanyahu that the U.S. is done fighting Israeli wars and arming the IDF. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin did the opposite on Wednesday and said the U.S. would attack Iran if it attacked Israel. Without Washington's steadfast backing, Tel Aviv will have to learn to live with its neighbors through diplomacy and trade, not bombs and bullets. That course appears unlikely. President Joe Biden has spent much of his life on Capitol Hill or the White House, arguing the American-Israeli bond must remain unbreakable. Biden labels himself as a Zionist and claims Israel is essential to American security. So Americans, at least those with some understanding of Middle East politics, are once again hoping the 85-year-old Ayatollah will once again be able to decide on a response that asserts Iran's sovereignty without provoking an outright war. And I think that's a real risk and a real danger that we continue to put ourselves in this position, and it's all in support of Israel. And so let's talk about Israel and get into what we're really supporting as Americans when we give this much backing to Israel. This one from DaveDeCampAntiWar.com, July 31st. Israeli lawmaker says raping Palestinian prisoners is legitimate. So a member of the Israeli Knesset has defended the idea of raping Palestinian prisoners after Israeli soldiers suspected of sexually torturing a detainee at the Seed Temin detention facility were arrested. The arrest took place on Monday, sparking protests from far-right activists, including several members of the Knesset and at least one minister in Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government. In a meeting of lawmakers on the next day, a member of Netanyahu's Likud party was asked if it was legitimate to insert a stick into a person's rectum. He replied, yes, if it's a Hamas militant, everything is legitimate to do. Everything. According to Haaretz, the Palestinian prisoner who was raped suffered from a ruptured bowel, a severe injury to his anus, lung damage, and broken ribs, and was taken to the hospital for an operation. The Times of Israel reported that 2 of the 10 soldiers arrested for the rape were released on Wednesday and that they were not the main suspects. The report also said that the Likud minister, a legal aid organization, not the minister, representing the 4 soldiers, claimed that the soldiers were acting in self-defense when they forcibly sodomized the Palestinian prisoner. The condition of the prisoner confirms some of the worst allegations made by Palestinians who were previously held in the torture camp. Senior nurse who was detained by Israeli forces in Gaza after he left the Al-Shifa hospital over allegations he was tied to Hamas told the New York Times that Israeli soldiers penetrated his rectum with a metal stick, causing him to bleed and leave him in unbearable pain. The Times report said a leaked report from the UN cited a 41-year-old detainee who said that interrogators made me sit on something like a hot metal stick. It felt like fire. And also said that another detainee died after they put an electric stick up his anus. And again, these aren't the totality of the reports of Israeli soldiers raping the Palestinian detainees, but it is enough to talk about for today. I mean, this is just horrific that the Israelis are doing this, and of course the Americans are backing it to such a large degree. So Israeli killing of Hamas political chief expected to derail ceasefire talks. So the Israeli assassination of Hamas's political chief in the Iranian capital of Tehran is expected to derail negotiations for a ceasefire. Now, of course, this is important and maybe a little less important than what we led off on today's show, which is Israel trying to provoke the U.S. Iran to go to a war. But what little hope there was for talks are likely derailed. So the Qatari prime minister, who has been mediating indirect talks between Israel and Hamas, expressed concern about the impact the assassination will have on negotiations. He wrote on X, political assassinations and continuing targeting of civilians in Gaza while talks continue leads us to ask, how can mediation succeed when one party assassinates the negotiator on the other side? Peace needs a serious partner and a global stance against the disregard for human life. So Netanyahu was doing everything he could to sabotage the chances of a deal before his trip to Washington, something that's been widely acknowledged by Israeli media officials. Haniyeh was Hamas's, or Haniyeh is how you say it. Haniyeh was Hamas's leading proponent of reaching a ceasefire deal with Hamas, while Hamas's top leader, Sinwar, who was believed to be hiding deep inside the tunnel system in Gaza. Haniyeh was the top official for a Palestinian group outside of Gaza and played a key role in negotiations. Progress towards the deal is not expected to be made as the region is bracing for Iranian retaliation for the assassination on its territory and Hezbollah's response to the Israeli killing of its top military commander in Beirut. U.S. officials told Axios that they're concerned the assassination of Haniyeh will derail negotiations and could lead to a major regional war. But the U.S. is strongly backing Israel, as Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin vowed it would defend Israel from any retaliation. The circumstances around Haniyeh's death are unclear. His deputy said Haniyeh was killed while sleeping at an official guest residency in Tehran. Al-Hana said Haniyeh was struck by a missile, but it's unclear if Israeli warplanes were involved. Israel previously carried out attacks inside Iran using small quadcopter drones that explode on impact. Haniyeh was in Tehran for the inauguration of the new Iranian president, who is considered a moderate and pledged to pursue diplomacy to get Western sanctions lifted, but the Israeli assassination will also likely derail any Iranian plans to engage with the U.S. on sanctions. And it's also important to remember here, it's not the first time that Netanyahu has engaged in this tactic. He also killed a senior Hamas negotiating official in Beirut earlier in that war. That official had actually been the one that had negotiated the first pause to fighting. That was a week-long ceasefire that saw 100 Israeli captives, hostages in Gaza released. And so there could have been more of that, but the Israeli government assassinated the first diplomat and now the second one for Hamas. Now, I do imagine that this isn't just like a country losing its foreign minister or secretary of state, right? If Antony Blinken, and I'm not recommending or suggesting any violence against it, but something happened to him tomorrow and, you know, he was a victim of some other country doing something like this to him, or if, you know, he just had a medical emergency and had to either resign or died or something like that, the next person up would simply take the role, and kind of all the networks of the State Department would just follow his lead as if he were Antony Blinken. This is quite different, right? There is trouble. It's already been difficult for the negotiating team based in Qatar to actually speak with Hamas and Hamas leadership on the ground and figure out what they're willing to agree to, and how many hostages are alive to swap, and all these really important details. So I'm sure it's much harder to reestablish that network and those connections when we're talking about Hamas versus a normal country like the United States, and how, what would happen if a member of their negotiating team was killed. I think this is even true of Ukraine, largely speaking, that a member of their negotiation team was killed or something, there would just be a next man up standard. That might be far harder to achieve when we're talking about Hamas. All right, so Hezbollah confirms its commander was killed in Israeli airstrike on Beirut. So Hezbollah on Wednesday confirmed one of its most senior military commanders, that's Fuad Shakar, was killed by an Israeli strike that hit a residential building on the southern suburbs of Beirut on Tuesday. Lebanese sources told Reuters that his body was found in the rubble on Wednesday evening, and at least 2 women and 2 children were also killed in the strike. He was also known as Haj Mohassin, was a founding member of Hezbollah. According to Lebanon's Al Mayadeen, he was one of Nasrallah, which is Hezbollah's Secretary General's closest advisors. Hezbollah said that Nasrallah would respond to the Israeli attack in a speech at Sakar's funeral on Thursday. The Lebanese group said, as for political stance on the sinful aggression and great crime, it will be expressed that Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah tomorrow in the martyred leader's funeral procession. Israel said it targeted the Hezbollah leader in response to a rocket attack that killed 12 Druze children in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. Hezbollah denied responsibility for the strike and blamed it on Israeli air defense rocket. And I think whether the okay, so I don't think the Israeli narrative is true that this was a targeted strike against this particular camp by Hezbollah. I think it's possible a Hezbollah rocket did hit it. It could have just gone off course. It could have malfunctioned. Of course, it could have been hit by an Israeli Iron Dome rocket and ended up crashing there. It's also possible it was an Israeli Iron Dome rocket. I don't see any reason at this point to believe either side intentionally targeted this soccer game. It really wouldn't make sense for Hezbollah to do so. These were 12 Arab children who were killed, and my understanding is all 12 of them would, at least their families, they recognize themselves as Syrian citizens who are living in Israeli occupied territory. And so from the perspective of Hezbollah, it's not inflicting any kind of blow on Israel to kill 12 Druze citizens, Druze children who are recognized as more citizens of Syria than Israel. It's not a major blow to Israel. So, one would wonder if really the quote false flag here is just Israel, kind of like Netanyahu is doing what Zelensky did when there was a Ukrainian missile defense that crashed in Poland, and he said, oh, the Russians did it, the Russians targeted Poland. Of course that wasn't true. It didn't make any sense that Russia would target a farm right across the border in Poland. But what was Zelensky trying to do? He was trying to have an excuse to draw the US and NATO into a wider conflict. And what is Netanyahu trying to do? He's trying to get excuses to give him grounds to escalate to eventually draw the U.S. into this conflict. All right, next up here, Iraq condemns U.S. airstrike as heinous crime and blatant aggression. So in all of the assassination news yesterday, there was one more major event in the Middle East. I mean, I'm sure there was more, but involving an airstrike at least, and that was the U.S. bombed the Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMF, in Iraq. So Iraq has strongly condemned a U.S. airstrike that targeted the country on Tuesday and killed several members of the PMF, a coalition of mostly Shia militias that was formed in 2014 to fight ISIS and is a part of Iraq's security forces. The U.S. attack came as Washington and Baghdad have been discussing the future of U.S. military presence in Iraq. U.S. strikes against the PMF in 2023 and the beginning of this year prompted the Prime Minister of the country, Sudani, to call for an end to the U.S.-led anti-ISIS coalition in Iraq. So a spokesperson for the Iraqi Prime Minister said, despite extensive efforts through global political channels in the efforts to end the presence and operations of the global coalition against ISIS in Iraq and transitioning to a bilateral security relationship based on mutual respect and safeguarding Iraq's sovereignty and security, the coalition forces have committed a heinous crime and blatant aggression. Such serious and uncalculated transgressions can significantly undermine all efforts, mechanisms, and frameworks for joint security to combat ISIS in Iraq and Syria. They also risk dragging Iraq and the entire region into a dangerous conflict and wars. Therefore, we hold the coalition forces fully responsible for these consequences following this flagrant aggression. The PMF announced on Tuesday that at least 4 of its fighters were killed in the U.S. attack. The U.S. bombing came a few days after a rocket targeted U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria for the first time in a few months, likely a response to a lack of a clear path for a U.S. withdrawal from Iraq. The U.S. bombing of Iraq came just hours after Israel launched airstrikes on Beirut targeting senior Hezbollah commander. If Hezbollah and the Iraqi Shia militias coordinated a response to the Israeli escalation, it could involve attacks on U.S. bases and Syria, since the U.S. pledged it will intervene to defend Israel. And one does have to wonder if maybe there's a feeling from either the PMF, Hezbollah, or Iran that the U.S. carrying out this strike in such close proximity, at least time-wise, to the Israeli assassination of Haniyeh in Tehran were somehow related, connected, coordinated, and that would certainly make them feel the U.S. is even more involved. All right, I want to talk about another one of my newsletters here. Again, you could sign up and make sure you get this newsletter at antiwar.com. Elon Musk endorses U.S. regime change op in Venezuela. So, tech billionaire and frequent contrarian Elon Musk is using his platform X to help the State Department install a new government in Venezuela. The world's most pervasive purveyor of election denialism, the U.S. State Department decided the Venezuelan people voted wrong on Monday and immediately began questioning the election results. Of course, the White House has no idea if the race was rigged, but it doesn't matter. To the American foreign policy establishment, elections are nothing more than an opportunity to put their chosen stooge into a position of power. Deep state regime change efforts in Caracas are nothing new. All recent U.S. presidents have tried to remove Nicolas Maduro or Hugo Chavez from power. However, for all the problems the socialist regime has, the Venezuelan people appear to choose Chavez and Maduro over the American-endorsed candidate. What's odd about this coup attempt is that it has the backing of Musk. Throughout the Joe Biden administration, the Tesla owner has often offered a contrary view to the White House. For example, Musk has proposed a ceasefire agreement for the war in Ukraine. On Tuesday, the Musk-owned X removed Maduro's gray checkmark, indicating official government status. The tech billionaire has also released videos and tweeted videos celebrating the Venezuelan opposition and a U.S. government wanted poster of Maduro. One might think that the Libertarian Institute would join Musk in seeking to out Maduro. After all, he is a commie. However, libertarian foreign policy is not merely knee-jerk anti-communism, it's anti-intervention. It's even if the target is a country's socialist nightmare. So the Ron Paul Institute's Daniel McAdams is one of the best voices on this principle. He often reminds us not to do the bidding of the CIA and to always be wary of regime change plots, which are virtually always in the works for U.S. adversaries. Otherwise, we risk becoming the very commies we seek to destroy. And I have a great tweet here up from McAdams where he essentially makes that point. He says, "I find it amusing how my opposing the CIA candidate in any given election where the U.S. intent is to unseat an enemy in power lands me on a cascading stream of insults from libertarians and other pro-freedom types. Like, dudes, do you really think the CIA is going to pick an actual pro-freedom politician to lead a country? Have you thought about this at all before you call me a commie?" So just a little great McAdams there. And again, sign up for my newsletter. There will be one out this morning, and then Monday through Friday mornings, I send those out. And Will Porter is still helping me format and make sure they look good for everyone. All right, next up here. So earlier this week on the show, we had mentioned that Ukraine was preparing to receive its first batch of F-16s, but it wasn't very clear what the details were when they would actually arrive in the country. All that was clear is that they would not be operating anywhere near the front lines, and there weren't very many pilots. So this one from Dave DeCamp, this is an update. Ukraine has received its first batch of U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets from NATO, Bloomberg reported on Wednesday, marking an escalation of the alliance's involvement in the proxy war. Bloomberg sources did not say how many planes have been received, only it was a small number. They also said it was not immediately clear if Ukrainian pilots trained by Western countries to fly the F-16s could use them right away or if the process would take longer. The Washington Post recently reported that only 6 Ukrainian pilots were expected to finish the training by this summer. If F-16s are put in use soon, they're expected to operate far from the front lines as U.S. officials fear they could easily be downed by Russian air defenses. Denmark and the Netherlands are supplying the first batch of the planes, and Belgium and Norway have also pledged to provide Ukraine with F-16s, but most won't be delivered for years. The U.S. hasn't promised to provide jets, but has helped in the training and will arm the F-16s with advanced missiles. So the Wall Street Journal reported on Tuesday that the U.S. had agreed to arm the F-16s with AGM-88 HARM air-to-ground missiles, the extended range version of JDAM kits, which convert unguided bombs to smart warheads, and so-called small diameter bombs that explode with tight blast radius. In addition, the U.S. will send advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles known as AMRAAM and AIM-9X shorter range air-to-air missiles and jets. NATO also reported, or not NATO, the Washington Post, I guess that's kind of the NATO mouthpiece right there. They also reported that the jets would fire the interceptors from the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems. So there will be, I guess, several munitions that these can fly. I'm pretty sure the HARM missiles are radar targeting anti-radar missiles. And so a lot of these do seem to be, for interceptions and destroying radars and things like that, not necessarily taking out Russian troops. All right, this is where we will wrap up for today. The U.S. announces $500 million in new military aid for the Philippines amid China tensions. So we already mentioned that Secretary of State Lloyd Austin was in the Philippines, where he was saying the U.S. was willing to go to war with Iran for Israel, but he's also stoking tensions with China. So on Tuesday, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced $500 million in new military aid for the Philippines while they were in Manila. Their visit comes amid soaring tensions with China in the region. According to a joint statement released by Austin, Blinken, and their Philippines counterparts, the $500 million is coming in the form of the 2024 Indo-Pacific Security Supplemental Appropriations Act, which was tucked into the $95 billion foreign military aid bill that President Biden signed into law in April. Blinken said at a press conference that the military aid will help modernize the Filipino Armed Forces and Coast Guard. The aid is being provided in the form of foreign military financing, a State Department program that gives foreign governments money to buy U.S. weapons. The U.S. and the Philippines also announced other steps to boost military ties, including a pledge to conclude a new intelligence sharing agreement by the end of this year and more U.S. involvement in military bases in the country. Last year, Washington and Manila signed a deal that gave the U.S. access to 4 more bases in the Philippines, bringing the total number of U.S. facilities in the country to 9. Blinken and Austin's visits to the Philippines came after Manila and Beijing said they agreed to a deal to ease tensions in the South China Sea around the Second Thomas Shoal, which is a Philippines-occupied reef that is also claimed by China, Vietnam, and Taiwan. China and the Philippines have disputed the details of the agreement, signaling it may not last, and the new U.S. support could embolden Manila to push harder against Beijing's claims. I guess it could also upset Beijing and kind of upend the process that way. Remember when we initially talked about it on the show, we broke down the Joseph Solis Mullins article. Of course, he's one of our great writers at the Libertarian Institute, who said it would likely only be temporary. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. That interview that I promised you all first last Friday and then last weekend, hopefully that will be out tomorrow. I'm also going to be on the Scott Horton show this weekend, so be sure to subscribe to his feed to check that out. And of course, everything I do does end up getting posted over at the Institute, so libertarianinstitute.org. And if you can, make a donation. We still have the matching funds going on, so it's a great way to help up this show, all the work I do, and the Liberty Movement, because there's a lot of great people at the Institute doing a lot of great work for liberty.